Greetings from afar, LTRR. I'm in Madison this week for a conference, so bad timing for me, missing Tree Ring Day and this tribute to Bryant Bannister. I was asked to provide comments about Bannister because I got to spend a lot of time with him, so here's a video tribute to Dr. Bannister. I arrived at the Laboratory of Tree Ring Research in 1989 to start my PhD studies. After a couple years, I was granted the A.E. Douglas Award, a recognition of achievement, or at least potential, at the graduate level in dendrochronology. Unbeknownst to me, that award came with money, which was applied to my bursar's account at the U of A. I date back to the bad old days when graduate assistantships didn't include waiver from tuition expenses. So, the next semester, I went to the bursar's office to pay my tuition as always. To my surprise, most of that bill was paid for by the Douglas Award. The bursar put it to me this way: "It looks like your tuition has been paid for by some guy named A.E. Douglas. Do you happen to know him?" I said yes, I guess at least I knew of some guy named Douglas. Here he is in his stadium office, the founder of LTRR. But actually, I didn't know Douglas very well, and suddenly I felt a need to get to know him better. I could certainly read up on Douglas, but boy, there was a living resource at the lab for really learning about Douglas. And that was, of course, Bryant Bannister, who overlapped substantially here with Douglas. I approached Bannister and requested one-on-one time with him to talk Douglas and learn about early days of LTRR. He was amenable, and we subsequently met once a week for some number of years, reading and discussing Douglas papers, with Bannister adding first-hand recollections. I'll cover just 3 Bannister stories that were not only interesting, but that also subsequently proved beneficial to me recently. 1. The first thing Bannister did with me was administer what he called the personality test. This test would determine if I had a suitably dry sense of humor to allow me to stay here. As many of us know, but I didn't know before this test, in the director's office there is a photograph taken by Douglas of the 1923 total solar eclipse. Douglas was both an astronomer and a photographer. Here he is at Sheppard Observatory, which he also founded. Douglas went to Mexico to photograph that eclipse. And here's a field shot showing a tent housing a 12-meter-long camera used at that eclipse. Douglas was good with extreme optics equipment. Douglas got his shot of the eclipse, namely the one hanging even now in the director's office. Bannister led me into the office, telling me to shield my eyes as I entered, and once in front of the photo, I took my first look at it. And here it is for you. The personality test here was whether a person laughs, or not, upon first seeing this photo. According to Bannister, some people just don't see the fly, or don't otherwise consider it odd that a photo of a solar eclipse would have a fly in it, and they don't laugh. I'm happy to report I laughed, and Bannister said, "Okay, you're in the club, you can stay here." Years later, 2013, as part of AmeriDendro Tucson, I co-led the weekend field trip to the Grand Canyon. A stop on the way was the Lowell Observatory in Flagstaff, where I gave a public lecture on the role of Douglas in establishing that institution. I showed Douglas's photo of the eclipse, effectively administering Bannister's test to about 100 people. Most everyone laughed right off, and I chuckled to myself, in private thanks to Bannister for giving me that experience so that it could be relived years later. 2. Douglas's time at Lowell Observatory was pivotal, so Bannister and I spent several sessions on that one. In particular, the famous sighting of light from Mars resulted in something notable. Namely, Bannister pulled out this political cartoon, which was printed in the Rocky Mountain News in 1901. In this cartoon, a being on Mars is holding a lantern, and a captain of industry on Earth is saying, "Just wait until I get up there, young fellow, and you'll be sorry you signaled." This is poking fun at the notion that the light from Mars might have been emitted by a Martian. The idea that Mars had sentient beings was in debate at that time, and it was a sensitive subject. Douglas was doubtful about intelligent life on Mars, and although Douglas certainly had a sense of humor, according to Bannister, Douglas bristled a bit at this cartoon as it seemed to make fun of Lowell Observatory for the notion of human-like beings existing on Mars. I like including cartoons in public presentations, so I added this one to my talk at Lowell Observatory, and the audience really enjoyed it. Once again, I voiced a silent thank you to Bannister, this time for showing me this cartoon. 3. Bannister overlapped here with another LTRR founder, Edmond Schulman, whom we also covered during our sessions. Here's a photo of both Schulman and Douglas in the field. What a nice shot, with both founders enjoying each other's company and the cool vintage field rig behind them. Among other things, Bannister and I discussed many of the dendro articles by Schulman published in the old Tree Ring Bulletin. Some 34 articles in the bulletin have Schulman as an author. One in particular was about early dendrochronology at Bryce Canyon National Park. Here's the cover of that TRB issue, published in 1950, with the Bryce Canyon article being the sole content. Lo and behold, last summer I visited Bryce Canyon, in part to see the famous geology and the lesser-known trees and forests, but also because my wife, Irene, was a volunteer ranger there. Since I knew rangers at the park, I was invited to give a public presentation at the historic Bryce Canyon Lodge. I was requested specifically to cover whatever dendro has been done at Bryce Canyon, so I dredged up Schulman's paper, reread it, and spoke as if I were an expert on Bryce Canyon dendrochronology. And yet again, I thank my lucky stars for having spent time with Bannister talking about such things, so that I could easily sound well-informed and relevant to the public at large. My talk at Bryce was a week after Dr. Bannister's passing, so at the end I whispered to myself one more sincere thanks to him for spending so much time with me, telling stories of the history of LTRR. I closed that Bryce Canyon talk, as I do now with this tribute, with a recent photo of Dr. Bannister. I miss him terribly.